Hello viewers. Today we shall attempt a comparative study of the nature of state in ancient Indian and medieval political thought. In the study of politics, the state is considered to be the starting point of any analysis and examination. The same is true for Indian political thought. For the convenience of understanding, we know that Indian political thought can be divided into three broad periods. The Hindu political thought is also called the ancient political thought. Ancient Indian political thought comprises both the Hindu systems of kingship as well as Buddhist systems of kingship. Thereafter, we have the medieval Indian political thought, which analyzes Islamic theories of statehood and kingship. Finally, we have the modern Indian political thought reflected in the writings of various modern Indian political theorists. Now, we need to understand that the idea of state occupies a central position in both Hindu and Islamic political thought. Both regard the state as an instrument for the establishment of law and order as well as for the preservation and persuasion of various forms of welfare activities. But what is imperative to understand is that the nature of the state, the origin of the state and the functioning of the state differs from the ancient Indian political writings with that of the Islamic political writings. Now, we need to understand that there are certain similarities and certain differences in the nature of state functioning in ancient and medieval Indian writings. In order to facilitate a better understanding of this entire area, we will first try to understand the features of Hindu political thought centering on the ideas of state, origin of state, functions of the state and kingship. Thereafter, we would move on to an understanding of the features of Islamic state, and then we'll try to understand the nature of the Islamic state from two perspectives. First, the nature and functioning of the state under the Delhi Sultanate, and next the functioning of the state during the Mughal rule. And finally, we'll attempt an analysis of the similarity and the differences between the two. The starting point of our discussion is the fact that both the Hindu and Islamic thought emphasizes on the fact that the state is a divine institution. However, when we are trying to emphasize and examine Hindu political thought, we need to start first with the origin of state and kingship. To understand the origin of state and kingship, we need to understand the scriptures that we'll be taking for our purpose of analysis. The concept of state and kingship connotates ideas of Raj Dharma, Rajya Shastra, Niti Shastra, and sometimes we find that ideas are scattered in different literature. For convenience of understanding, we'll take into account the following texts: Kautilya's Arthashastra, Manusmriti, Mahabharata as the principal text to understand the nature of the state in ancient India. What we'll try to do is follow a comparative methodology to understand the areas of similarities in the writings of these three theorists. All these works that we just focused on emphasized on three broad theories of the origin of state. First, the theory of divine origin, theory of social contract, and the organic theory of the state. The theory of divine origin focuses on the divinity of the king and the divine attribute of the institution of state, which can be found in texts like Aitariya Brahmana, which can be found in Kautilya's Arthashastra as well as the Mahabharata. The divinity of the king exemplified in the fact that the king is a divine symbol. Because he is a divine symbol, the subjects should express their absolute allegiance to the king. And that is the reason why the divinity of kingship focuses on the fact of absolute political allegiance or absolute political obligation of the subjects, which is also called unlimited political obligation. Now, we need to understand that the different texts do not converge on who created the state. What they converged on the fact that It is the lords who created the state. And the king is a symbol of divinity in the sense that the creator may be Brahma or Vishnu. There was another theory very popular which was called the social contract theory. Now, this social contract theory envisages a kind of a contract wherein the people propose a segment of their produce as taxes to the king, and the king is obliged to protect the subjects. We also need to understand that this nature of social contract varied from the Hindu to the Buddhist tradition. While in the Hindu tradition, people were not offered many choices regarding the selection of a ruler. The Aittariya Brahmana focuses on the fact that Indra was chosen because he was the most valiant and the most powerful. However, we can go a step further in finding aspects of social contract in both Kautilyan Arthashastra as well as in the Manusmriti, not to forget of the mention of social contract in the Shanti Parva of Mahabharata. One thing is common in all these writings, that it was Matsanaya, or the state of anarchy and lawlessness, which led to the birth of a state via contract. But we need to understand that the Buddhist text Digha Nikaya goes a step forward in analyzing the social contract, where we find that the people, because of the fear of lawlessness and anarchy, selected a ruler. And there was a sense of reciprocal obligation wherein the subjects gave a part of their produce as taxes to the ruler. In return, the ruler promised to take care of the subjects and punish the evildoers. If you compare the social contract theory, you will find the Buddhist theory of social contract was much more concrete and advanced than the Hindu conceptualization of social contract. Nevertheless, the Hindu conceptualization of social contract focused on both divinity of the king as well as existence of a contract between the ruler and the ruled. There was another important theory which was popular, and that was the organic theory of the state, where it was envisaged that the state was constituted by various elements, and all these elements were complementary to the functioning of the state. And this can be exemplified in Kautilyan analysis of the Saptang theory of the state, where the state comprises of 7 elements. Each element played a role in subserving or in fulfilling the needs of welfare state. Now, these theories were the basis of the nature of the state in Hindu conceptualization. Let us move on with another understanding of the nature of the state. Ancient Indian thinkers regarded the state as an essentially beneficent institution which evolved in prehistoric times for the efficient protection of human life and for the better realization of its higher ideals. They held an organic conception of the state. The king, the ministry, the territory, the resources, the forts, army, treasury, etc., all were extremely important, and the state could not do either with the treasury or the fortresses or with the soldiers. Now, it was considered to be important for the king to keep all these different elements complementary to each other, because if one element failed to perform its functions, then there would be calamity or disaster within the kingdom. Thus, the Hindu conceptualization of state provided a realistic analysis of the state, in the sense that they were aware of the fact that it was important for all the elements of the state to perform their functions efficiently and effectively if the state was to maintain law and order. Now, there is a lot of literature in ancient India on the aim of the state. The aim of the state in the post-Vedic period was fourfold, and that was promotion of dharma, arth, kam and moksha. These were considered to be the 4 ideals of human life which the state was supposed to promote and protect. The ideals of dharma, arth, kam and moksha included all-round moral, material, and spiritual development of human beings. Now let us move on to the functions of the state as espoused in the various literature written during the ancient period. The functions of the state can be broadly divided into two types. First, the constituent functions, and second, the ministrant functions. The constituent functions are those functions which are essential for the maintenance of society. The state therefore in ancient India performed functions as of defense from foreign aggression, protection of person and property, and preservation of law and order. The king was the protector and enforcer of law, morality, and dharma. Ministrant functions are those functions which the state promoted in order to uphold the welfare of the public. The evidence of the Mahabharata and Arthashastra show that the sphere of state activity was broad enough to cover all aspects of human life: social, economic, and religious. The state was to offer facilities to different groups of people to ensure that there was a moral upliftment in human living. It was to improve the social order as well as to encourage learning, education, art by subsidized learning academics and extending patronage to scholars and artists. Thus, the state provided special facilities for the betterment of the educational standard of the public. In fact, some of the welfare functions of the ancient state included establishment of rest houses, providing charity to the poor and needy, providing for old age facilities to people who did not have a place to stay, providing relief and distress measures to people affected by floods and famine. It was also the duty of the state to encourage and facilitate trade and commerce by building a network of roads, highways, as well as construct various forms of industries. In fact, it was also the duty of the state to ensure that people were protected from evils and vices like gambling, drinking, and prostitution. Thus, the state in ancient India was considered to be the center of social activity, and its sphere of functioning was comprehensive and all-pervasive. The state had an elaborate machinery to perform its functions, which included ministers, bureaucrats, armed personnel, as well as various cadres of civil services. The principle of decentralization was an important feature of state activity. We need to understand that ancient Indian literature contains ample evidence of various forms of decentralization measures undertaken by the monarch from time to time. The village was the basic unit of state, and the village headman or gramik was supposed to be the lowest administrator in the state. It was also believed that there was an adequate and elaborate system of dissemination of laws and regulations, as well as public opinion was respected. Thus, democratic principles of public opinion and decentralization of power can be found in the different literature on ancient India. It was also found out that there were popular assemblies such as the Sabha and Samiti, which worked in close compliance with the bureaucrats and the civil servants. Next, we come to another important area of Hindu political thought, and that is the relationship between state and citizenship. The question of relationship between state and citizenship has been discussed in detail in the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata, Kautilya's Arthashastra, and most importantly in the Manusmriti. The ancient Hindu writers considered political duties of the citizens as part of the general duties. We need to understand that while Western political thought emphasized on rights, Indian political thought emphasized on duties of citizens in terms of swadharma. The citizen was bound to the state by a number of political obligations. The state was the only institution which stood between the citizen and anarchy, and therefore it was the solemn duty of the citizens to pay unconditional allegiance to the state and the king. Now, it was also believed that if the power and prestige of the state was not there, says Manu, the strong will fry the weak like fish in the oven. Most people will give up their appointed duties, and even dogs will begin to lick the oblations intended for gods. What we need to understand is that the concept of duties was considered to be supreme and all abiding. If duties were not there, there would be total anarchy in the state. Therefore, through Swadharma, Ashram Dharma, Varna Dharma, Kula Dharma, Dampatya Dharma, the individuals performed several obligations which facilitated law and order within the state. Thus, the relationship between the citizens and the state was one that was bound by dharma. Laws were considered to be divine in origin, and the citizen was expected to obey the state because the state was the only agency for the enforcement of laws. We also need to understand that when we were studying the organic theory of the state, among all the different constituent elements of the state, the citizen was also a part of the state in terms of Janapad. Janapad refers to the territory and citizens. The prosperity of the state depended on the prosperity of the laboring masses. If the people were able to pay their taxes on time, the state would be able to offer them law and protection of order. Thus, the Hindu state believed that the state should provide for maintenance of law and order, protection of the general populace. At the same time, the public should render their allegiance to the state. This complementary relationship would work a long way for moral and material advancement as well as progress. Let us now move on to another important area of discussion, and that is kingship. Monarchy was the most popular form of government in ancient India, though certain times republicanism was also not unheard of. Now, the doctrine of divinity of the king was widespread. The ancient Hindu writers did not say that king is himself God, but observed that his functions were similar to that of God. Secondly, the king was regarded as the upholder and supporter of law. The essence of rulership lies in dharma, and the king should realize that there is nothing higher than Raj Dharma, and he was supposed to maintain and uphold Raj Dharma. The texts also focus on the fact that the king was the servant of the people and he was supposed to work in the interest of the population. The kingship was regarded as a trust in the sense that the state treasury was not the personal property of the king. Rather, he was supposed to safeguard the state treasury, and the money from the state treasury should be used in the welfare of the general population. There was no constitutional check upon the unjust and oppressive king, save that of religious and spiritual sanctions. But we need to understand that religious and spiritual sanctions created great terror in ancient India. The only text which speaks of the right to revolt against an unjust king was the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata states that if the king fails to perform his functions, or if he becomes arbitrary and despotic, he should be killed like a mad dog. Except this text, we do not find any other text speaking about an unjust king and what can the people do in order to remove an unjust king, because it was believed that the king can do no wrong, because Raj Dharma was the final power of the king to ensure that he keeps within the limits of his power and authority. So what have we studied from this analysis of Hindu idea of kingship? First, we understood that the institution of state and kingship was considered to be divine, though theories of social contract were heard of. Second, we found that monarchy was the usual form of government, though certain other forms of republics can be found in ancient India. Some form of oligarchy or city-states were also not uncommon. Third, we found that the various constituent elements of the state played an important role in the functioning, and out of these constituent elements, the king played the most important role. The aim of the state was to promote all-sided development of the subjects, and it has to ensure dharma, earth, calm and moksha. Finally, the Hindu state was considered to be a welfare state. Let us now move on to another area of discussion in order to facilitate a comparative understanding is that of the nature of Islamic statehood. The rise and expansion of Islam has a deep-seated impact on the social and political institutions of the Middle Ages. It is said that the Islamic theory of the state coincided with the popularization of the religion of Islam through Prophet Muhammad, who preached far-reaching principles of a new social order enshrined in two revolutionary concepts. One was unity of God and the second, unity of human origin. Islam preached monotheism. These principles had a profound impact on the political and state structure of the Middle Ages, and here we find that the advent of Islam in India also led to the establishment of a new state system. In fact, the nature of the Islamic state follows from the principles contained in the Shariat and the Quran. The Islamic state from its very inception was a theocracy par excellence. Traditional Islamic law does not acknowledge the independent existence of the state, nor is state regarded as a primary condition of human society. According to the Islamic law, state is only an instrument to serve the creed in the attainment of its objectives or fulfillment of the ideals of Muslim brotherhood. The Islamic theory of state was based on threefold idea. One scripture, that is the Quran, one sovereign, that is the Caliph, and one nation, that is the Milad or universal brotherhood. In fact, we need to understand that there was unity of the state, religion, sovereignty, and Muslim brotherhood. The basic feature of the state, according to this theory, is indivisibility in all these respects. It contemplated the establishment of a theocratic state based essentially on Islamic law and recommended only one sovereign, the Caliph, who would rule both the political world as well as the temporal world. And that is what is known in the idea of the threefold unity, which is considered to be in the Holy Quran, in the Caliph, and in the Muslim brotherhood or Milad. Now let us try to understand the nature of Islamic state as examined from the perspective of the Delhi Sultanate as well as the Mughal rule. It is important to understand that when the Delhi Sultanate was established, they believed more in centralization of powers rather than decentralization. The purpose was the establishment of an Islamic state, and therefore the functions of the state varied from the Hindu conceptualization of the state in the sense that the Delhi Sultanate wanted to establish a firm stronghold on the Indian territory. The Sultanate of Delhi was considered to be an Islamic state by the Turco-Afghan rulers. It was a theocratic state where the head of the state was also the religious leader of the people. He was expected to enforce the Islamic law, that is the Shariat. His object was to transform the Darul Harb into Darul Islam. The government of the sultans was based on highly centralized despotic principles. The word of sultan was treated as law. The sultan was considered to be the pivot around which the entire legal, administrative, and executive structure of the administrative machinery revolved. He was the chief executive, the sole legislator, and the fountainhead of justice. In fact, all functions of the state were concentrated in the sultan. The sultan had multifarious duties because it was a centralized state. The first and foremost duty was protection of the Islamic faith. The second duty was defense of Muslim territories and protection of the frontiers against foreign invasion. The third function of the state was enforcement of the criminal code and administration of justice. Thereafter, the Sultan was entrusted with the task of collection of revenue, disbursement of grants and wages to those who deserved, and allowance from the public exchequer. Appointment of trustworthy as well as capable counselors and administrators was also a function of the Sultan. Controlling public affairs through personal inspections and general supervision was also confined within the duties of the Sultan. Now, it has been clearly stated that the Sultan forfeited his claim to the throne if he failed to perform the duties deliberately assigned to him. If he willfully did not discharge his duty, he could be removed. However, what is important to understand, his duties towards the Muslim subjects and non-Muslim subjects were also clearly defined. The infidels or the non-Muslim subjects were not to be treated as full-fledged citizens by the Sultan. Nevertheless, once these infidels or non-Muslims acknowledged the suzerainty of the Islamic State and agreed to pay jizya, they acquired the status of zimmis, and the Sultan was under the obligation to provide for protection of their lives and properties. Thus, the Sultan had functions both relating to maintenance of law and order as well as the protection of both Muslim and non-Muslim subjects who accepted the suzerainty of the Sultan. Let us now move on to the Islamic State under the Mughals. We already know that it was Babur who laid the foundation of the Mughal Empire. Later on, great Mughal emperors like Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan played an important role in the expansion of the Mughal Empire. We also need to understand that there was difference of functioning in the nature of the Islamic State under the Delhi Sultanate and that of the Mughal Empire. In the case of the Mughal Empire, the authority of the state was all-comprehensive and all-embracing. Against the king, the law had no coercive process, which meant that the king cannot be bound by the law that he has created. There was no legal procedure whereby he could be compelled or he could be punished. Being the sole interpreter and in many cases the sole originator of laws, he could not be held guilty for breach of any of the laws made by him. The king, though below no man, was below God and the holy law, and therefore he was expected to follow the Shariat. The royal commands were considered to be the supreme, and it was the duty of the emperor to ensure that the laws were effectively enforced and implemented. Kingship was a divinely ordained institution, and obedience to the king was a religious as well as a political duty of the subjects. The state law was a command of the sovereign and was binding upon all. In fact, if you look into the nature of monarchy during the Mughal period, the maxim that was followed was that the law was the command of the sovereign. What can be deduced from the nature of the Islamic State? The idea of state in Islam was a theological and metaphysical concept. It was based on the concept of unity of God and unity of human origin. The state was an instrument of social and political value, but the functions of the state was more towards religious functions, and political functions and welfare functions came later. And since God was the ultimate spiritual basis of life, loyalty to God virtually amounts to man's loyalty to the emperor. The functions of the state was to establish equality within the Muslim brethren, end racial differences and slavery, and most importantly, ensure that the individual's life and property was well safeguarded. In fact, one of the very important aspect of Islamic theory of the state was that it ended any form of discrimination between man and man. The only discrimination that was allowed was on the basis of one religion and another religion. However, I should mention here is the fact that with the introduction of Din-e-Ilahi by Akbar, this notion of religious discrimination was also done away with, where he brought about unity of all religions. It proclaims that there is no virtue except in good deeds. One important thing to mention here is that ethics and morality played an important role in this entire Islamic theory of state or kingship. Based on this analysis of the Hindu nature of state and Islamic nature of state, let us try to understand the similarities and differences between the two. If we try to move on to the differences, we need to understand that while Hindu political thought can be found, while ideas pertaining to politics and state can be found in different literature such as the Vedas, the Manusmriti, Arthashastra, Mahabharata, Dighanikaya as a Buddhist text. However, Islamic thought draws heavily from the Shariat. Therefore, we find that Hindu political thought, there is differences of opinion among the different ancient writers on subjects like state, sovereignty, political obligation, justice, etc. Another important point of difference is the fact that while in the case of Hindu thought we find the existence of monarchy, republican states, oligarchy, etc. In the case of Islamic thought, we find the sole emphasis given to an absolute monarchical system. In the case of Hindu political thought, while emphasis was on individual salvation, it was in the terms of ashram dharma, varna dharma or swadharma. In the case of Islamic political thought, the ultimate ideal was Muslim brotherhood. So while the individual and the community was emphasized in Hindu political thought, Islamic political thought emphasized on the unity of the entire Muslim brethren. Both accepted the need for political authority, the duties of the ruler, the establishment of a proper state system, maintenance of law and order. However, there are differences in the nature of the state and the type of authority. While Hindu political thought emphasized on decentralization of powers, both the Mughal as well as the Delhi Sultanate emphasized on centralized absolute monarchical system. However, one point of similarity in both the Hindu and Islamic point of view is that the state was considered to be the pivot around which law and order, protection of the people centered, and thus the aim of the state, irrespective of whether Hindu or Islamic, remains the same. It is the attainment of the greatest good of the greatest number and welfare of mankind. That's all for today. Thank you.